Well, this week, the question that we're looking at, we'll examine, we'll consider, is gambling a sin? And to begin, Doug Wilson himself, this is what his initial comment on this was, that gambling is essentially a system set up for poor people who are really bad at math. Because it doesn't add up. But to continue to digress, to actually answer the question and handle it from a biblical standpoint, what does the Bible actually say about gambling? Well, the first position that is the common, probably evangelical position that people take as they talk about gambling, they will say, well, the Bible doesn't actually mention anything about gambling specifically, which is true. So the position that they'll land on that is to basically apply it to a wisdom principle and say that it's just not wise because the odds are not in your favor that you will not win, so it will more than likely be a waste of money, so it's not wise to do. I'm going to take it a little deeper. I don't think that actually captures the full gamut of what's taken place. And in particular, when I'm thinking of gambling, I'm thinking of gambling at the temple of the casinos, or people that habitually pay their tithes to the lottery ticket. I'm talking about like the major system of gambling. I'm not necessarily talking about like a church raffle or a fantasy football league, which I'll address that in a second. But what I'm talking about are people that bet their odds and their future by gambling, whether at a casino or whether at a lottery ticket. And when a person habitually does that, essentially what that is smacking God in the face and saying that your world is ordered by chance and not by providence. That's the biggest issue when it comes to gambling, particularly when a person is habitually gambling at a casino or buying lottery tickets, hoping that in the future they will make it big and that income will provide for them. Really what we're saying is that this world is not ordered by providence, it's ordered by chance. That is definitely the biggest problem. The problem is that is a person claiming autonomy and claiming they know how God has ordered this world rather than how he has ordered it. Now let's answer a few questions that people have on that. I mentioned a moment ago fantasy football or a church raffle. Now the Bible doesn't necessarily mention anything that it's a sin, but like I said, when a person is betting their odds in the casinos, it's essentially saying that God's world is ordered by chance. But if a person wants to play in a fantasy football league and throw a couple bucks in to see who wins at the end, or if there's a church raffle, like we can have a free conscience to go ahead and to do that. There is nothing unbiblical or sinful in that. We should not look at every little tiny thing. If we get together with a group of friends and we throw a few dollars in at the game to have some fun, I think a person should feel free to do that, because we're not betting our odds for the future based upon that game. We're just having a good time, and we know there's a good chance we might lose that income, that money. There's nothing wrong with that. Second thing, casting lots. Now, many people will say that the Bible does teach that gambling is a sin and we should never participate, and they base it on casting lots, and that's just really not a strong argument. Casting lots in the Bible were used to essentially divide up portions of things, like dividing the land of Israel. It wasn't necessarily gambling, it was trying to actually be as impartial as possible for a situation like dividing up the land of Israel. For instance, how it could work today is I have 5 brothers and 1 adopted sister, and let's say that someone gave us a piece of land, and that land was divided up into 7 different portions. On that piece of land, there are going to be some portions that are better than the others. There are going to be some that you would rather want to have your house on than the others, and the only equal and fair way to do that would be to have some sort of way to cast lots or pop rock, paper, scissors, some way like that to make it fair for who gets the piece of land. That is how casting lots was actually used in the Bible. It was a way to try to be as impartial as possible. And the final question that I'll tackle is sometimes people would say, well, if a person starts a business or does anything like that, that is gambling. And I would say we need to distinguish between gambling and risk as well. They're not the same thing. Risk is very biblical. When a person has when they look at different things and they have calculated risk and they move forward in faith, trusting that God is going to provide, that is not gambling. That is taking calculated risk. Now, there are many people that play the stock market and do things like that really they're gambling away their future because the odds are not in their favor. But gambling and risk are not the same thing. For instance, church planting, statistically speaking, is very, very risky. It on paper, sometimes it doesn't make sense. But as a church planter, what essentially you do is you make the plans, you study, you try to remain biblical and faithful and do all of these things and trust in God in the future that He will provide. The same that goes for a business owner. My wife and I started a rental real estate business, and we know that there's an element of risk involved. We've been doing it for several years right now, but we're taking it as a very conservative approach, limiting our debt to no debt many times, and operating that way. We don't spend all our profit. We have a mentor who knows the field. These are things that minimize the risk, but there's still an element of risk involved. You could have a bad tenant, your house could catch on fire, many different things could potentially take place. But that's not the same as gambling. Risk is biblical. It's a biblical concept, and it's having faith in the future and having calculated risk, and distinctly different from gambling. So really, to close it all up, I would say this, that gambling is really more of a worldview issue. If you gamble, do you gamble hoping for a better future? If you're doing that, you're essentially saying that God orders His world by chance.